Hi, this is Michael. Welcome back to the World War II Book Guy. Today we're going to talk about another one of my favorites, Crusade in Europe by Dwight David Eisenhower. Now, this is another one of those books that I put into the category, if you've only got one shelf of books on World War II, this should be on it. Now, my copy is old. I've had this book for over 40 years, and it has an ex libris from a prior owner, which I always liked. Now, this is the personal memoir of Dwight Eisenhower in his role as commander in the Second World War. It is his personal view on the events, the personalities of his experience. And when reading it, you can take a view on that, whether or not you agree with his decisions or how he states things. I think the important thing with reading this book is to understand Eisenhower, the man, the immensity of the task that he took on, and the way that he rose to that in a way that no other individual, I believe, could have done. There's an argument that Marshall could have taken on the job. Marshall ultimately was not put into that role for a couple of reasons. FDR told him he couldn't sleep at night knowing that he was gone. But Marshall was indispensable in his role, in his sound strategic vision on the American Chiefs of Staff. Now, Marshall, for all of his strengths, I don't believe could have done it as well as Eisenhower did. Marshall, for all his brilliance, was a somewhat distant and formal individual. What Eisenhower brought that made him successful was his ability to forge and maintain relationships in a very difficult alliance, right? And that was no easy task for him. He had to deal in the United States with the chiefs of staff and the president. He was stationed in the host country of an ally. He also had to deal with their chiefs of staff. And Sir Alan Brooke, the head of their chiefs of staff, was not a fan of Eisenhower. And on top of that, he was right at hand and had to deal with the rather eccentric and somewhat persistent demands of Prime Minister Churchill. And he dealt with that and bonded and kept an alliance. And that was no easy task either. By the time we got to Europe, he commanded Torch and he commanded Sicily. But the biggest battles, of course, were D-Day and the invasion and subsequent destruction of the German army. Now, he had two subordinate commanders that he had to deal with, his two army group commanders. Montgomery, 21st Army Group, British and Canadian, and Bradley, who commanded the American 12th U.S. Army Group. Now, to take Montgomery first. Now, Montgomery was certainly no fan of Eisenhower, and he was, in a word, insubordinate. He continually lobbied to take over as the overall ground force commander, and this got to a point over the course of time that Eisenhower, who was trying to let that go, finally had to say, let's have a showdown. Let's put it to the president and to the prime minister, and Montgomery backed down. But that did not make him any less a difficult person to handle. Whole different conversation with how he handled de Gaulle and the French. But even with the Americans, now, Bradley was a loyal subordinate, and he had three principal army commanders under him, Hodges, Simpson, and Patton. And Hodges and Simpson both were, again, reliable and consistent. Patton, for all of his brilliance, could be very difficult. And this went all the way back to the handling of the slapping incidents in Sicily. But there's also disagreement in strategy. Montgomery and Patton, for their own egotistical reasons, both believed that they should be given the bulk of the resources so that they could do a single thrust into Germany. Now, Eisenhower was steadfast in his belief, his strategic belief, that the objective was to destroy the German army and that was best done with a broad front strategy. And he stuck to that even when his subordinate commanders, Montgomery and Patton, both advocated for a narrow thrust. They were army commanders, and Eisenhower had the ability as the overall commander to understand the implications of that, both strategically and simply from a logistic standpoint. It was his strategic, steadfast vision that made him so successful. And understanding, better than anyone else could, the importance of maintaining an alliance, in fighting an alliance war. And that is why he was a great man. This is a great book, and I highly recommend that you read it. Now, as I said, when you read a memoir, it's good to read a biography as well to balance it. I happen to like Supreme Commander by Stephen Ambrose about the war years of Eisenhower. And also, there's so much said about the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery. Here's another book, Ike and Montgomery, by Norman Gelb, that I would recommend. Okay, so until next time. Now, next time we're gonna talk about a book that I did not even know existed until about a year ago. It is The Memoirs of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. Now, I did not know this existed. I never knew he had the time to write it. Kind of a heads up on that one. They hung him at Nuremberg. But in the 6 weeks prior to that, he wrote this. It's more for a specific audience than the general audience, but we'll be talking about that next time. Anyway, until next time, this is Michael, the World War II book guy, out here.